This week we're talking about the reading assignment, Ritzer chapter 3, and I would like to do so by answering or addressing some of the discussion questions. And the first one is globalization imperialism? And you will hear this, especially from those on the political left, criticizing scholars who theorize about globalization, saying that it's just globalization is just a euphemism for what is imperialism. So let's go back and take a look at what imperialism was and what it could be. So originally we're talking about a long time ago. We're talking about the 1500s and the 1800s. So imperialism are the methods employed by one nation state to gain control over other areas of the world. And once they gain control over those areas, they tend to exercise control over those areas. Imperialism is not the same as colonialism. Colonialism is basically the outcome of imperialism. So there were two eras of colonialism. The first was in the 1500s that involved the empires of Portugal and Spain, and they colonized areas in Africa, the Americas, and Asia. And then the second period of colonialism was in the 1800s, and it involved Great Britain, France, Germany, the United States, and Japan. So several more countries began colonizing. Now, after World War II, most of the world figured out that it's wrong. It's a problem to go around taking over other nations. And so they formally released the territory back and the sovereignty back to the colonies. And after this occurs, then there is this notion of post-colonialism. But before we get to that, if we want to answer our question, if we're looking at two criteria, namely the era of globalization being sort of more current in the last 50 years especially, then clearly imperialism in the 1500s and 1800s is dated, and we could say no, that was something different. If we are looking at imperialism as having to do with a nation state, if it has to be nation-based, then since we don't have countries that are formally, colonizing other countries, you might say, no, it's based on the nation state, and we don't have colonialism anymore. However, it gets a little more complicated when you look at what's going on presently. And if you envision that imperialism can occur not from simply nation states, but large multinational corporations that are headquartered within nation states, or if it can occur more indirectly through the nation state's control of international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. If you are looking at those processes and arguing that basically the outcome is the same, even though many poor countries, poor areas of the world are not former colonies of another country, they are still dominated by them in some way, economically or politically, or even if we're talking about countries or areas of the world being dominated by multinational corporations instead of nation states, then you have a stronger argument. But for our purposes here today, I'm going to weigh in and say no, globalization is not the same thing as imperialism. However, I do think imperialism is a part of globalization. It's one of those processes, it's one of those flows. The reality is there are large, powerful countries and large, powerful multinational corporations that would like to advance their self-interest by being able to control other areas of the world. And maybe they don't do so by formally taking them over, but there are other ways to exercise control via economics, via politics, via the military, and so forth. And this is where David Harvey's concept of capitalist imperialism is perhaps still valid. He argues that the growth of capitalism, the growth of markets, and remember, Vladimir Lenin came up with this term imperialism, talked about it being the highest stage of capitalism. Vladimir Lenin was the the first ruler of the USSR, of the Soviet Union. He led the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and was the first leader of the Communist Party. And he basically looked at capitalism as business basically taking over, and those who control business, the elites in the countries they live in, basically taking over the world to be able to exploit its labor and resources. And of course he was opposed to that. So if you go to David Harvey, who's coming from sort of a neo-Marxist perspective, and Lenin was a follower of Marx, he's assuming that capitalism needs to expand and grow and so forth. And it is this imperative that is the most powerful in terms of what is driving globalization. And he also talks about not just being economic, but how the political ties in with the economic. You know, sometimes political arrangements are made for the best interest of business. Sometimes they aren't, and sometimes business interests advance themselves without so much of a governmental intervention or political dealings. But for Harvey, it's capitalism, and we can look at globalization as a form of softer, more indirect, albeit effective imperialism. All right, the next question has to do with the relationship between Westernization, Easternization, and globalization. And these are, again, not the same. I think they are closely related, but they are not the same. So Westernization is a long-standing term, and it is derogatory. It's not looked upon favorably by many because the idea, like imperialism, is that first Europe and then later the United States joins in. The idea is that they're imposing themselves on other less powerful countries, mainly through trying to install Western-style democracies and trying to get countries, areas to adopt Western-style free market capitalism. All right, so having said this, Westernization has had a great deal of impact, first Europe and then the United States, on other areas of the world. There's plenty of documentation. However, even when they do have impact, such as your book talks about governments in Egypt and Pakistan, basically trying to install democratic governments. And these democratic governments, unlike Western-style democracies that are sort of orderly and long-standing, have been quite unstable and can be overthrown. So they don't, just because there's an influence from the West doesn't mean that it basically homogenizes the entire country, their culture, their economy, their government. In fact, it mixes with it. So that's Westernization. The other thing here is that Easternization, back when we were talking all about Westernization, the East was kind of an afterthought as they were isolated, not as affluent or powerful economically or militarily. But now we have China and Japan and other countries, and we have visibility to these countries through mass media and the news and so forth. So you've seen in Europe and the United States things that go on in the East be adopted here. It does not have the same derogatory tone, however, because at least at this point in time, nobody is claiming that China is imposing its economy or its government on other countries and other areas of the world. Although I'm not saying that is, I'm not ready to say that's not happening. We know that China's getting very active in Africa, but at this point in time, Easternization is usually seen as more of just the simple adoption of cultural practices. So yoga is a big one, martial arts, right? Eastern foods, Eastern dance, basically anything you can think of that originates in Asia. That is common practice here is a form of Easternization. Even in the workplace, your book talks about automobile companies, adopting Japanese practices of manufacturing cars. That too is a form of Easternization. So the answer then is basically no. Easternization and Westernization are not the same as globalization, and there's really no cause and effect relationship there. They are two processes of many processes within globalization. And they are certainly important ones as the West continues to have influence on the world. And the East, especially China, is continuing and growing in its influence over the world. So these are two processes that continue under the broader umbrella of globalization. So the next concept we want to talk about, it's another ization concept, is Americanization. And I think we can think about Americanization similar to Westernization, with the exception that it is a more current phenomenon, especially after the era of World War II. After World War II, I should say, the decades following World War II were ones in which the United States was the dominant hegemon, as they say, the dominant power militarily, politically, economically in the world. So, of course, they had a great deal of influence. And Americanization is also a term that is not always received favorably, as with Westernization, people believe that it is imposed. The culture of a powerful country, the United States, is imposed on other less powerful countries in terms of democracy, wanting markets. And later, after the decades following World War II, starting in the 70s, this Americanization became seen more as the exportation of consumer culture. So the exportation of McDonald's, Starbucks, shopping malls, and this sort of what is seen as excessive consumer culture with too much emphasis on material goods and the sale of material goods and services, and profit being sort of the bottom line of social life. This was the reaction of many around the world to Americanization. So Americanization is a useful concept, I think, especially following World War II. And your book points out that the United States continues to be a superpower, and the United States is not the only country in America. There's Canada and Central America and South America, all of those countries. And so they also have some impact as time moves forward. And because of the historical circumstances and the growth of America as a dominant cultural, economic, political superpower, there can actually be Americanization without America. So there are many people from other countries that come to study here. They go do their graduate studies, and then they take what they learn back to their countries and transform their workplaces or their governments or whatever it is they're engaged in, without their country necessarily being affected by a nation like the United States. Okay, so it's important, but again, globalization is not the same as Americanization. Again, this concept is more relevant for an earlier era, and there's plenty of information about the United States being in decline. It is still relevant, of course, as a factor, but it is one of several. We just talked about Easternization, Westernization, talked about China. Okay, so there is a question about whether the Great Recession basically, killed or made Americanization an outdated concept. I don't think so. When they talk about the Great Recession, this is the 08-09 recession, and we're still really feeling the effects of it with the collapse of finance and the mortgage industry and so forth, and all of the fall of the stock market, the loss of jobs and so forth. So the idea is if the rise of the American economy after World War II made Americanization a valid concept, did the fall of the American economy with the Great Recession make it no longer relevant? I believe the American economy, and most people believe the American economy in terms of international power, began to decline in the early 70s. So the Great Recession is only the latest sort of indicator that the United States the economy is not as large and powerful and stable as it once was. But as you can see here in 2017, there's been widespread recovery from the Great Recession, and I think the United States is still a very powerful player in the world, whether we're talking about culture, economy, or politics. So no, the Great Recession did not kill Americanization. But no, Americanization is not the same as globalization. So the next question has to do with theorizing globalization. And it's asking if we are living in an era of post. And let me take a minute to explain what that question means. So in the past, there were these concepts that seemed to explain a lot about how the world became more global and international. And some of those terms we talked about today. We started with imperialism and colonialism. We moved to Americanization and Westernization. However, there are those that would say that, the decline of the West, the decline of Europe, the decline of Great Britain, then of the United States, basically leaves a void. There is no one dominant superpower, and there is no one dominant sort of Western or American culture that's perpetuating itself across the globe and clearly standing apart from others. And if that is the case, if we don't know, the question IBS becomes, if it's not the United States, if it's not Europe, which countries is it? And it's not clear. Right now we live in a period of much instability, much unpredictability, rapid social change, multi-directional global flows and processes. So I think it's easy to say, well, it was pretty easy to understand what happened during the last century, but clearly that's not the case anymore. Is this the end of history? And in fact, we're going to talk about that. There is a theory called the end of history that explains, the collapse of capitalism and communism, which were the two dominant political economies, the 20th century. That's done, but the United States is on decline. China is on the rise. The East has more influence. Where are we now? And for those who argue about the post, they are basically focused on the end of these big century-long or longer factors and countries that organize the world. My opinion is simply this, that at any moment we are living in the present, and the present comes after the past and before the future. And I think it's easy to look back on the past and to be able to retrospectively explain what was going on at that time and to be confused by the present. But I think we have to remember that a new theory will emerge. We will understand the present just as we understand the past, but these things have to develop, all right? We have to see what happens with the rise of China and the influence of the East. We have to see what happens in the United States, what happens with Europe. I don't think that we are at the end of history by any stretch of the imagination, but it certainly is a more populated, more socially complex and global society, and therefore it's much more difficult to explain than perhaps it once was. Now the next chapter on neoliberalism, I think, is a pretty compelling explanation if we want to talk about something other than this concept of globalization as being a dominant driving force to this very day. I think those that make the argument about neoliberalism are definitely onto something, and we're going to talk about that theory. It is the topic of chapter 4, so we'll be talking about that in video 4. So yes, we have entered an era of the post, but this era is also an era of the present, and it's an era of the before, the pre. So don't worry, the end of history is not upon us.